This morning, I'm going to make fun of our two elder statesmen that were up here this morning. I felt like I was 10 years old sitting out there again with Lee Hansen up here singing and Pastor Glenn, just to see the passion on their faces as they sang those songs. And they may be old, but not the guys. The songs may be old. They're kind of old too. But hey, that's all right. They're old too. It's okay. We're all old. Yeah. But the songs may be old, but the words still ring true. And so I think it was good this morning to kind of go back to those songs. And sometimes it's good to hear the messages in those songs. And the new songs are great, and the music's great, and the energy's great. But sometimes those hymns just hit a little bit different. And so this morning, watching all the worship team, but especially those two guys, and especially Lee, it just transported me back to a different time in my life. So I felt blessed to have those songs this morning. So as we get into the Word this morning, I have it titled Misery into Ministry. And so I'm going to give you a brief little synopsis, and then we're going to get into the whole thing. So the walls of the city of Jerusalem were rubble. This news made Nehemiah very sad. So Nehemiah began to rebuild. He led the people day in and day out. Enemies attacked, but they overcame. God helped them finish the work in only 52 days. The Jews who had once been in captivity now returned home, and it was misery into ministry. And that's the story of Nehemiah. So if you have your Bibles with you today, let's turn to the book of Nehemiah. You guys can go to the table of contents if you don't know where it's at. It's okay. It's hard to find. It's one of those Old Testament books. It's not super big. I know in my Bible, it's on like page 432. So if you want to start there, you can just turn to 432 and kind of go from there. If that helps you to get close, then hey, we're one step ahead. So let's look for the book of Nehemiah. And as you're going there, let me tell you this, and we're going to start this way. Listen carefully this morning, because I believe that God's going to stir something up in many of you this morning in your life, and the world around you might be a little bit different. It's not going to be the same after we leave this morning. For those of you that are the best of the best, the brightest of the bright, the best looking, if you were voted most likely to succeed, if you were the head cheerleader, the star athlete, I want you to know that God can still use you. I promise you that He can. For those of you that always felt like your life was just ordinary, kind of plain, this sermon's more geared for you. God specializes in using ordinary people. In fact, that is in many ways the driving force of the story that we're going to look at today. It's all about a guy named Nehemiah. So who was Nehemiah? Well, he was a cupbearer. He was the cupbearer for the king Artaxerxes, who was a Persian. And what is a cupbearer, you might ask? Well, he wasn't a priest, he wasn't a prophet, he was not a king, he wasn't a warrior, he was just a simple cupbearer. This was the guy that had a job of tasting the wine in the cup before the king did. That's what he did. Cup would get passed, he would take it off the king, he would sip first. Doesn't sound like a bad gig. Except that his job was to figure out if there was poison in the cup. So, it was cool if you liked wine, unless someone tried to poison you. Then it wasn't so cool. It was a pretty bad job. So, basically what a lot of commentaries would say is that Nehemiah was a glorified butler. Right? He would sip the king's wine. He would make sure that was all kosher. It was all good. And the king would be happy and thankful that Nehemiah didn't die. And if Nehemiah died, I guess he would have been pretty happy too, because he wouldn't have drank from that cup after. But what happened was Nehemiah was greatly bothered by something deeply inside of him that was occurring to his people. And God ended up taking this ordinary butler, and He's going to raise him up and change the world in only 52 days. So let's look at Nehemiah chapter 1, and we'll read the verses 1 through 4, and then we'll let God speak to us today. So, the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa. So I'm going to stop right there. Let's pause. Time out. What is Kislev? We don't know. It's not on our modern calendars. No one knows what it really is. But if we're looking at our calendar, it would be around November and December-ish when he's writing this. So that would be about the time of year that we're putting up Christmas trees and decorations to celebrate Christmas, except that Christmas hadn't come yet. And for some of you, you guys are putting up Christmas lights in October, so this wouldn't work for you either because this is in November or December. So for those of you that put it up in Halloween time, you're ahead of Kislev. And like I said, Jesus wasn't even born yet. The year was 444 BC, over 400 years remaining until the birth of Christ. And for Susa is modern day Iran. So if you want to know where Nehemiah was, he was in Iran, and that's where they're talking about. So let's go to verse 2. Verse 2, Hananiah, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, "Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." When I heard these things, that would be Nehemiah, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. So let's unpack that a little bit. So we have to understand kind of the context of what's going on here and why Nehemiah was so upset. The walls of Jerusalem have been down for 140 years, and this was a tremendous embarrassment for the people of God. Not only was it embarrassing, but it left them vulnerable to more attacks from the outside. And just kind of put it in your mind in the context of 140 years, that would be like us saying the walls of our nation have been down since the late 1800s. And so the people of God were very depressed. They felt like they had no hope. They thought life is never, ever, ever going to get better. The walls of our city are broken down. Well, how did it happen? Let's figure that out. How did the walls of Jerusalem happen? Fall to pieces here. So if you know the story of the Old Testament, God told the Jewish people, he said, "If you obey me, I will bless you. If you disobey me, there will be consequences." And the beginning of the Old Testament is all full of that. I just had my class on the Old Testament, and every book that we looked at, it was all about God said, "I will do this for you if you obey me." The people said, "Great, we'll do that." And then the people strayed, and then God said, "I told you what was going to happen if you didn't listen," and then there was a punishment that followed. This is no different. This is another one of those instances where God said, "Follow me, seek me, I will take care of you," and the people strayed. So here we have, God's people. They had turned their hearts from God. They had drifted a little bit. They were worshiping false gods and idols. They were performing all sorts of sacrifices that were displeasing to God. So God said there will be consequences for your disobedience. And this consequence in this case happened to be the Babylonians. So God allowed the Babylonians to come in, utterly wipe out the entire city and a lot of the people with it. So I want to give you guys kind of a brief history lesson because that's a lot. Babylon was just one little small part of this big puzzle. So I'm going to tell you kind of how Babylon came into power, what happened when Babylon came in and took over the city. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a brief history lesson. So several of you have just heard history, and now you're going to check out. So let's not check out on the word history. Let's stay focused. Let's stay really in here. I'm going to give you a quick rundown on the exilic period of time where we're talking about Nehemiah. So throughout the Old Testament, it's really interesting to see that God used other nations as his instruments. And so it says that in Scripture, too, that he used the king of Babylon as his instrument. So the king of Babylon wasn't in charge. God was in charge. These other nations weren't in charge. God was in charge. They were his instrument. So he used them to draw back his people to him and draw their attention back and their hearts back. Around this time, the Israelites really wanted a king. All the nations around them had kings. Here they are. They're being ruled by judges. And they decide, hey, you know what? We want a king too. We want something that's here, something that's tangible, something we can see. We want a young, strong ruler. Look at all these other countries. They're doing it. We want to do it too. Right? And here's Samuel. He's one of the last judges. And Samuel gets upset by this. They come to Samuel and say, "Samuel, you've been great, but you're old. We want a king. It's time for someone new. We want to be like everybody else." And Samuel kind of already knew that this wasn't what God wanted, but the people were really adamant about wanting a king. So in 1 Samuel 8, 6 through 7, if you guys want to go there, if not, I'll read it to you. There was this quick little exchange about this idea of a king. But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this pleased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told him, "Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king." So God fully understood, and he was trying to tell Samuel, "Samuel, this isn't about you. This is about me. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me." And so God said, "Samuel, give them what they want," right? They're no different than you or I. They wanted something in front of them, and they struggled a little bit to stay focused on God. So they wanted something there in front of them. So by asking for a king, God had allowed it, but he knew how it was going to end. It wasn't going to work the way that they had hoped, right? They really wanted this leader, and he was going to lead them, and they were going to be great. And so began the line of the kings. And one after another, what did they do? They drifted from God. They started to pull the people away from God. And it wasn't what the people had hoped. So God said, "Enough's enough." We gave it a chance. Actually, the kingdom split into two at one point. And so they broke even further. And then the northern kingdom, they got overtaken. And then the southern kingdom was the last stronghold. They were it. And God said, "Now's time," right? You guys have run away from me far enough. I've let you stray far enough. It's time to come back. Enter Babylon, right? Babylon would come in. They're going to absolutely demolish Israel, and they're going to destroy Jerusalem. They're going to destroy the temple. They're going to tear down the walls, and they're just going to devastate everything that's there. Babylon at this time thinks, "Hey, we're in good shape." But Babylon's not going to escape God's wrath either, right? Because God just doesn't care about the Israelites. He cares about everybody. And so he wants everybody to know who he is. He wants everybody to come to a knowledge of him. He wants everybody to worship him. So the Babylonians aren't going to escape this all on their own. They're also called to worship God, but they also rejected him. So they're going to face their own ruin, and most of them fell to the Persian Empire. So that's our little history lesson on kind of where we're at with the Babylonians. So back to the Babylonians and their conquest of Israel. They come in, destroy everything. They destroy the temple, which is incredibly important. It was the place of worship, right? It was the hub. It was where everything happened. The temple, destroyed, gone. They tore down the walls, and they took people into captivity. This is where the story of Daniel takes place in Babylonian exile. Pastor Glenn preached about it a while back. Daniel just wasn't some average guy, though. Daniel was smart. Daniel was super intelligent. Those are the people the Babylonians took. They took the rich. They took the smart. They took the intelligent. They took the hard workers. They took the wealthy. They took the priests. They took all the people of value, and they left the weak. They left the farmers. They left the poor. That's all that remained. The weak and the poor and everybody that was left behind, they're not going to do anything. They're not going to be able to organize. They're not going to be able to build back the city. So here you have all of these people, all the people that could do something are now under Babylonian rule in Babylon, right? So some years later, Babylon eventually gets their punishment. They get their comeuppance, right? In comes Persia. Persia takes out Babylon, and things start to get a little bit different for the Jews now. The new king of Persia, Cyrus, he let some of the Jewish people go back to the city, and just a very few of them, they're the remnant, right? They go back in two shifts. And so you have two different groups that go back, and their focus is to build the temple. The first group goes back. They don't get a whole lot done. They just get the foundation built. But they've started, right? So they go back, and they're trying to begin again. So they get the foundation built. The second group that goes back, they get the temple built, but it's nothing like what it used to be. But now they have the temple at least built. So here you have two groups that have gone back. They're able now to resume worship. They're able to resume following God. They're able to get back together in that little bit of community. But there's still a lot of people in exile, and they still don't have any walls. They still have no protection. They're kind of just left out there all vulnerable, right? Anybody can come in and attack them again. And it was super humiliating to God's people. It was very humiliating because they were once a great nation, right? They had they had a wall, a beautiful city, a beautiful temple. Now they have a temple that's a fraction of what it used to be. So the whole nation was distraught until one man, a cupbearer, a glorified butler, an ordinary guy, had what I call a Popeye moment. So now, with the raise of hands, how many of you would honestly say you know who Popeye is? Okay, it's mostly some of you older folks in here. I didn't see a whole lot of young hands go up. There we go. So it's Popeye the Sailor Man. Toot toot. There you go, Pastor Glenn's on it. Now, if you don't know who Popeye is, Popeye was a cartoon character, right? He was really big way back in the day. He was big when I was a kid. I remember watching Popeye. His arms were massive. They were bigger than his thighs, but it wasn't really his arms. It was super awkward because it was like his forearms were big. His biceps weren't big, but his forearms were big. He always had this enemy. His enemy's name was Brutus, and let's call it what it was. He kind of had a pretty ugly girlfriend in Olive Oil. She wasn't that great. She was like the old cheer, UGLY, you ain't got no alibi, right? She was ugly, but he loved that woman, right? He loved her to death. Brutus, for some reason, he really liked her too. I couldn't see it, but both of them were fighting over olive oil all the time. You know, it was a mess. You had Popeye. He loved this woman, and Brutus, he wanted her too, and there was always this battle between the two. And Brutus would always try to steal olive oil, right? That was almost every episode. Olive oil would get in some kind of trouble and usually involve Brutus. And then Popeye would bust out the spinach, right? He would pull out this can of spinach and he would squeeze it. And he would squeeze it and the spinach would pop up and he'd open his mouth, he'd catch it in his mouth, and boom, his arms would go huge, right? And then he would say this famous line, right? His famous line, if you guys know it, you can say it with me. He'd say it. That's all that I can stand. I can't stands no more, right? He had had enough, right? And his arms would get massive, and then he would just get this incredible strength. Part of me thinks that, the Spinach Consortium was in cahoots with the cartoon industry to try to make spinach look cool so kids would eat it. I tried it, and as you can tell, it does not work. So I said, forget it. I'm not eating any more spinach. I don't care if Popeye gets tough. I tried it. I didn't get big muscles. I'm out. So no more spinach for me. Never tried it again. So anyways, Popeye would eat his spinach, right? And then he would just go crazy. He would just beat down Brutus, and he would beat him up, and he would just, take back olive oil. Good for him. He really loved that woman. He would say, that's all I can stand. Somebody's got to do something about this. It might as well be me, right? I've had enough. So let me repeat that last part. Somebody has got to do something about this. It might as well be me. That's what Nehemiah is going to do. He's going to look at the broken down walls and the tragic condition of his people, and he's going to have a Popeye moment. That's all I can stand. I can't stand to watch this. Somebody's got to do something about this. It might as well be me. So repeat that last line with me. It might as well be me. So how many of you have seen the videos of a dog messing with the cat, right? There's a cat. The cat's laying all nice and cute, right? Because cats are awesome. Dogs are terrible. Cats are always calculated. Dogs are kind of just all spastic and nuts. I'm a cat person, obviously. So, the cat's laying there and the cat's all chill and the dog's jumping at the cat, right? And the dog's pawing at the cat, and the dog's barking at the cat, and the cat's just all cool and calm and collect, right? The cat's just sitting there, just looking at the dog. It has that look like, are you serious, buddy? Are we doing this again? You know how this ends, right? And so you have this dog is just constantly berating this poor cat. Cat doesn't really care, and then whammo, right? The cat attacks. The cat just out of nowhere just starts smacking the dog, and the dog runs away, right? The cat couldn't stand it anymore. The cat had had enough, right? He attacks the dog. Off the dog runs. And so I know some of you have seen at least one of those videos, most likely 100 of those videos, and you laugh every time even though you know what's coming. And so in that instance, you have the cat saying, I could take so much, but I've had enough. I can't stand any more of this. I'm going to do something about it. And so I have a similar story. Most of you know I work in a school. It was after class. I was walking with the math teacher that I help. It was a female math teacher. Her and I are walking down the hall, and she spoke to a young man that was walking down the hall. He had said something or done something. I'm trying to recall what had happened, but he did something that the teacher wanted his attention for. Well, he just walked on past like it was no big deal. Just walked on right past. She turned and said, hey, I'm talking to you. Well, you need to come back here. Which he reluctantly turned around and he comes back. And as she's speaking to him, he's doing one of these, right? And he's looking at her, but he's like looking right through her. And she's asking him questions and he's not answering. And when he does answer, it's a one-word answer. And finally, I had had enough, right? I had watched this go on for several minutes, the utter disrespect. It was to an authority figure. It was to a female, and I had had enough. And I finally snapped. I raised my voice and said, hey, man, listen. She's speaking to you. A little bit of respect here is needed. So you're going to answer her, and you're going to look at her, and you're going to talk to her like you're supposed to. I had had enough. I couldn't stand it anymore. I stood there as long as I could. I was going to do something about it, so I did. So finally, she ended up having the conversation with him, and he walked away, and I apologized to her for stepping in. She said, no, I appreciate that you did that. She said, that was good of you to do that. She said, he wasn't listening at all. And I said, I could see that. So I'd taken as much as I could, and then I finally stepped in. And every now and then, I'm sure many of you out here have the same situation where you look at something and say, no, I'm not going to tolerate that. Somebody's going to do something about it, and it might as well be me. And so we're going to watch as God takes a very ordinary guy who draws a line in the sand, right? Nehemiah draws a line in the sand and said, no, this isn't okay. Not while I'm around. Somebody's going to do something about this. It might as well be me. And so I want to show 3 principles of how God will use ordinary world changers. So the first thing, if you're taking notes, ordinary world changers, who are they? They're people that will sit down and cry. Ordinary world changers will sit down to cry. It's what Nehemiah did. Nehemiah 1 verse 4. He said, when I heard these things, what did I do? Everybody say it aloud. He said, I sat down and wept. He did the very same thing that Jesus did when he approached Jerusalem and he was up on the hill and he saw that they had turned the temple into a marketplace. Jesus was overwhelmed and overcome with emotion. He just broke down and cried. Jesus looked at the people and he said, they don't have a spiritual leader. There's all these sheep without a shepherd. And so he cried. He was overcome with emotion and he cried, just as Nehemiah had done 400 years earlier. He heard about the bad news about the city and the ruins that it was in, and he sat down and cried. But here's the thing. It wasn't a sniff, sniff, boo-hoo type of cry. This was ugly crying. And I'm sure most of you know what I'm talking about. Some of you here know exactly what ugly crying looks like. Don't look at your neighbor. Don't elbow anybody. Don't look at your wife, husbands. We know what ugly crying looks like, right? It's, if you're a lady, it's the makeup is running, right? The snot's flying. It's all kind of a mess, right? It's just a giant show, right? And there's nothing you can do about it, and you don't care how you look. You don't care that your makeup's running. You don't care that there's snot. Fellas, you don't care that your eyes are red and you're doing this weird thing with your mouth because we don't really know how to cry that well, right? So that's exactly what Nehemiah was doing. He wasn't just like a single tear. He wept, and he didn't care how it looked. He couldn't even stand up. He just sat down and cried. He was so overwhelmed with emotion that he sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. But the key was, it wasn't for himself. He wasn't sad for himself. He was sad for someone else. So the interesting thing was that he was about 1,000 miles away from his home. So I kind of tried to figure out a way that maybe you guys can visualize this. 1,000 miles, that's 132,000 school buses stacked together. Okay? That's like walking from here to Orlando, Florida. So some of you are like, well, Gary, that's not too bad. Well, yeah. Except that he didn't have a car or an airplane. That's pretty far. 1,000 miles. So here's Nehemiah 1,000 miles away. And it would have been super easy for him to go, you know what? That's someone else's problem. That's their problem. It's far away. I don't have to really deal with it. And I don't know. I know that I've done that myself. I hear about something and it's easy. It doesn't really affect you because you're not there. You're so far away from it. You're detached from it. And so I'm kind of like Nehemiah. I mean, he's living in a palace, and his life was super comfortable, and it would have been easy for him to say, man, that's too bad about the city. It's too bad about their walls. Maybe they'll figure it out one day. Maybe I'll write a check, and that will appease, some people. And, you send some money to appease your guild a little bit. Maybe I'll just, I'll pray for them. They're over there. I'll send them a prayer, and that'll be okay. But you don't really let the burden really sink into your heart. You don't really stop and let it sink in. I don't know about you, but I've been pretty skilled at ducking pain. I can avoid pain pretty well. I can avoid, reading all the bad news or seeing it on TV. You're like, oh, that's pretty bad. Next one. Or you see a commercial or you hear about hungry kids and you're like, oh, that's pretty bad. Speaking of hungry, I wonder what's for dinner. Maybe we can go cook something, or wonder what Rebecca's going to make, or maybe we can go out to eat tonight. And it's gone. It's there and it's gone. You're on to something else. Nehemiah, though, he was different. He opened up his heart to something, and he said, you know what? This isn't okay. This just isn't okay. What's going on is not okay. And so what I want to do is push you a little bit. And I want to ask you this question. What is it that breaks your heart? So think about it. What is it that breaks your heart on behalf of God? What is it that God dislikes in this world and that you divinely take on that same burden and say, God, break my heart for the things that break yours? So if I were to ask people on Facebook what breaks your heart, a lot of people might say whenever children are neglected or abused, right? That'll be a big one. I can't stand that either. I hate it. A lot of people might talk about sexual abuse or violence. Anytime for me that you hear about a guy beating up a woman, that really makes me mad. It's like, hey, buddy, why don't you come over here and say that to me, right? Don't pick on her. Come pick on me. And that might be wrong to you. I shouldn't say that, come pick on me. But still, it makes me mad, right? A lot of people might say human trafficking. That's a pretty big thing right now. When you think about taking teenagers and selling them for their bodies, it makes you ache. It makes you upset. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Sound of Freedom. Maybe raise a hand if you've seen it. I don't know. Okay, there's a few that have watched it. So you'll understand this. I'm not endorsing the movie in any way. The premise is powerful and it's based on a true story. Rebecca was like, hey, let's watch this. And I regret that I agreed to it because I cried. I sat with clenched fists for most of the movie. I was angry. I wanted to do something. I was appalled by the lack of respect for young people's lives. That movie just absolutely crushed me because it's true. It's what happens in our world. It was hard to watch. I wanted to quit my job. I wanted to go rescue lost children. And I wanted to punish people that took and hurt kids. Like my heart ached after watching that movie. It was tough. And so some people might ache for people who were bullied. Some might say on Facebook that ungodliness in movies is everywhere, and they might be upset about that. Some people might not like the way that Christians are portrayed. I know I've had conversations in my home, and I know that we bring that up all the time when there's, the spiritual person on a movie or TV show. They're kind of like the goof or the doofus, and they're out there, and they're strange. And that really bothers me, that we're portrayed that way, because that's not who we are. There's other stuff too. You can almost bet that if you'll open up your heart, that you'll find something that will break your heart, that will cause your heart to ache. And so I encourage you this morning to open up your heart. What bothers you? And don't appease, don't ignore the burden, don't ignore that feeling, but open up your heart and let that feeling in. Let me tell you, it's easy to ignore that, right? It's easy to push that off and say it's someone else's problem, like I just talked about. That's thousands of miles away. What can I do? How can I really be a difference maker? So why doesn't anybody else seem to care might be a question that you ask. Why is it that I care? Let me tell you why. Because God chose you. That's why. That's why somebody else might not care. God gave the burden to you. You didn't choose the burden chose you. So, it's deep down within your soul. And if you'll open up your heart, God can turn your misery into your ministry. I thought I'd get some amens for that one, but I didn't get any. It's lonely up here. He can take the things that make you miserable and the things that ache in your heart, and he can turn that into your ministry. And so God can take that and he can use you. Somebody has got to do something. It might as well be me. Who does God use? God uses those who will sit down and cry. Second, God uses those who kneel down to pray. So, what's the first thing that Nehemiah does after crying? He prays, right? He seeks God of heaven and says, God, here I am. Look at this. I'm so upset. This breaks my heart. Verse 4 says it, for some days I mourned. We're talking days that he mourns. He said for some days, not for an hour, some days he mourned. He fasts and he prays to God. I know all sorts of people who would say, what can I do about this big need? I'm just one person, or we're just one little family, or we're just one small group. What can we do? Well, let me tell you what you can do. You can pray. You can pray to the God of the universe. Some of the most important time you'll ever spend on earth is when you seek God in prayer. But I'm only one person. I want you to catch this, because this is, I like this. I'm here to tell you that when you say I'm only one person, that God plus one is always a majority. God plus one is always a majority. Every single time. God plus you, each one of you, is a majority. So through the story of Nehemiah, you can see how God works in the lives of an ordinary person, a butler, a cupbearer. We are no different. God can use each one of us right now. So God can and will raise you up to be a leader. You may say, I'm a stay-at-home mom. No, you're a leader. Well, I just cut hair for a living. No, you're a leader. Well, I just mow yards. No, you're a secret agent from God disguised as yard man. Right? I'm telling you, God's going to raise you up as a leader, and we have the example of Nehemiah, a cupbearer, that becomes one of the greatest leaders in history. So God can use you in the face of opposition, just like he did Nehemiah. Because I'm telling you, when you get a burden and you step out on faith to do something, you can put it down on your calendar that your spiritual enemy is going to show up through people or circumstances and try to oppose you. So it's like, I appreciate Pastor Glenn this morning talking about that. He didn't know I was going to say that in here. And he said that. As soon as you take that burden and you say, you know what, God, this breaks my heart and I know it breaks yours. I want to do something. It's coming, right? The bullseye is going to be right on your back. But God is going to be there to help you push through that opposition. He's going to be there to help you change the world. The enemy will come at you, just like what happened to Nehemiah, and try to distract you from living out and fulfilling God's vision for you. But right now in these verses that we're looking at today, we're going to see a man remain laser focused. He stays focused. And when you're laser focused, I'm telling you that you can change your world. And through the power of God, everything that Nehemiah did was bathed in prayer. Everything he did. We see 12 instances of him praying in Scripture. The whole rest of chapter 1, in fact, is a powerful prayer. And God raised up a great leader who was a praying leader. The strongest leaders will be praying leaders. And through his prayerful leadership, something that should have taken years took 52 days. And God, through an ordinary praying man, rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. Miraculously, in 52 days. I'm telling you, in a very short period of time, when God gives you a burden and raises you up as a leader, God can do something significant in this world. I want to challenge you this week to open up to someone about your burdens that you have in your heart and pray together about them. We're going to expose our burdens and we're going to pray. And God is going to use some ordinary people right here in this room to start changing the world. So who does God use? God uses those who sit down to cry. God uses those who kneel down to pray. And thirdly, God uses those who stand up to act. God uses those that stand up to act. I think sometimes we forget this step. After a significant time in prayer, what did Nehemiah do? He didn't sit down and just hang out and keep having prayer meetings, but he went to the king. He went to King Artaxerxes, the king of Persia, and he said, I need your help. I'm distraught over this. I want your blessing. I want your support. If you know the backstory, you can read about it in Nehemiah chapter 2, and you can turn there right now and follow along as I kind of paraphrase in the way that I do it. But so I'll have it up on the screen for you. So he went in before the king to taste the wine and give the king the wine, and the king looked at him and said, you look really sad today. And if you just read the text, it says, the king said, I've never seen you sad before. And the Bible says that Nehemiah was very afraid, and he should have been afraid, because whenever you go in before the king, you always go in with a smile on your face. You don't go in all, woe is me. Here, king, here's your wine today, buddy. I lost my tail. You know, you don't go in all Eeyore, right? You can't go in all Eeyore, right? Because all throughout history, if the king didn't like the way you looked, and there were times when the king was having a bad day, he says, I don't like the ugly look on your face. Kill that guy. That's what would happen. And some of you are lucky that there are no kings around this morning. So you better check your faces. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Guys all look wonderful today. Smiles and great, ready to go. But that's the thing. Nehemiah went into this situation, and it was dangerous for Nehemiah. But Nehemiah was so broken by the fact that these people, his people, were struggling, that he just couldn't hide it anymore. He couldn't hide the pain on his face. And so Nehemiah was visibly upset. And the king sees that because it's unlike Nehemiah. And so why are you upset? And the very next thing, before he asks the king for his blessing, he butters the king up. So teens and husbands, write this down. Anytime you want something, butter them up first. Thus saith the Lord. It's right there in Scripture. I mean, watch. Verse 3, it says it, right? He says, the king said, what's the matter with you? And I said to the king, may the king live forever. See, right there. He's buttering him up. Okay, so you're great, king. You're handsome today. I like that robe you're wearing. Makes you look strong, king. Your hair looks great. You're looking younger, or your teeth whiter. Anyway, you've lost some weight. May the king live forever. Right? He butters him up. He gives him a little bit of praise. And then he says, and you can almost feel the trembling in his words, because it would take a lot of courage to do this. And you can feel his emotion. He says, why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed with fire? And he says, you know, he's miserable over this. And then the king says, well, what do you want, right? And the king is open to this. The king is open to Nehemiah's plight. So it tells you that Nehemiah and the king had a decent relationship, because he's receptive to what Nehemiah has to say. So, you know, the king says, well, what do you want? And the very next thing Nehemiah does is he throws up a flare prayer, right? Right there before he says anything, he's like, God, help me out. Here I am. He sends it up looking for help. What he didn't do was go into his closet and pray for 3 days. And, you know, he's like, God, what do you want me to say right here, right now? Let's get this taken care of. So he's walking in an attitude of prayer. He sends up a prayer to God right then and there. And so Nehemiah answers the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, let him send me to the city of Judah where my fathers are buried. So that what? I want all of you to say it aloud. Send me to the city where my fathers are buried, so that what? I can rebuild it, right? I can rebuild it. He's not going to send some other people. He's not going to send a delegation. He's not going to form a board and they're going to vote on things. He's going to go. Nehemiah is going to go. Send me. He's not going to whine about it. He's not going to sit around and complain. Why won't somebody else do something about this? Because God has given him the burden. His ministry, his misery became his ministry. And I'm looking at this and I'm saying, as long as I'm alive, if there is a breath within me, I'm not okay with this. And on behalf of God, I will declare, not on my watch, somebody has got to do something about this. It might as well be me. I'm telling you right now, some of you are going to get a vision from God, and he's going to stir something up inside of you. It's going to happen. And I'm telling you, the world is going to be different around you because you're going to get a vision. Something that you look at and say, no, 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 not on my watch. I'm not okay with this. Not today. That's not right. Somebody's got to do something about this. Maybe I'm the one God has appointed. And all the voices inside of you are going to start. But you're not. You don't know enough. You're not smart enough. You're not old enough. You're too old. All these things are going to happen. And your response to that should be, no. No, I'm not. I'm an ordinary person that God has called to an extraordinary task. Me plus God is a majority. Somebody has got to do something. It might as well be me. So many of you remember when the tornadoes hit Kentucky. It's nice to see Bill here. Bill, you were on my heart when I came up with this. So we had ordinary people here, and not to say you're ordinary, Bill, because you're not. You're extraordinary. But we had ordinary people here and on our district that when those tornadoes happened, they said, we've got to do something. It might as well be me, right? They loaded up trucks and trailers. They drove through the night to be a blessing to a community who was reeling from such a horrible tragedy. They did not wait for somebody else. They had a burden for people whose lives were just turned upside down. The people who went used their misery for their ministry. They said, we're going to change our part of the world because I'm not okay with this. Somebody has got to do something. It might as well be me. And that's what they did. They loaded up and they went. They called off work. They told their families, hey, I got to go, right? They put everything on pause because they had that burden. And so another example is I get real emotional when I think about September 11th. I was a freshman in college, so I was very impressionable at the time. I remember where I was when it happened. I was in class. We had a student. It's not funny, but it was funny at the time. We had a blind student in my class, and he said, hey, all this is going on. And he said, I heard it on the radio, and everybody was kind of like, no, you didn't hear it on the radio, and the professor was like, no, you didn't. And he was right. He heard it on the radio, and they immediately sent us all back to our rooms, and that's when I kind of watched everything we knew as Americans just get tossed into uncertainty, right? And so it was a very traumatic thing when it happened for a lot of people, and for me, I kind of was at that age where it was a pretty big deal because I could have got drafted, right? I was 18 years old. Everything just exploded, and here I was in college. I'm like, this is big. Like, people don't do this to America. So it was tough. Twice I've been to the memorial in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. I don't know, have any of you been there? Okay, yeah, I've been there twice. And you can read all about the events. And I kind of have the same reaction as I did with the Sound of Freedom movie. I go in there, I get a little teary-eyed reading the things. I get a little angry, like I want to go do something. But the reason why that location is there and why that place is even significant is because of a 32-year-old dad. He was up in the air when he got a phone call from people on the ground, and he said, hey, what's happening, right? It's chaos up here. What's going on? People on the ground said, hey, listen, they're flying planes into buildings. They plan on taking yours to kill thousands of people. The goal of the people on your plane right now is to kill people. And so here you have this 32-year-old dad named Todd Beamer. And in that moment, he said, somebody's got to do something about this. It might as well be me. And he said, let's roll. That ordinary guy became a hero. And I'd give anything to know how he took those terrorists down and took that plane down in the middle of a field. Thousands weren't killed because of some ordinary guy said, somebody's got to do something about this. I'm not going to let them take the lives of innocent people. It might as well be me. Let's roll, baby. Let's take this thing down. That's exactly what he did. Ordinary guy did something extraordinary. He didn't wait for somebody else to do something. He acted. And so I'm telling you, it's going to get in your spirit, and you're going to look around and go, but I can't do everything. The needs are so great. And you're right. You can't do everything. I don't disagree at all. You just can't. There's just too many things wrong in this world. You can't do everything. But I'm here to tell you that you can do something, right? You can't adopt every child. Maybe you can adopt one. You can't foster every kid. but you may be able to foster one and then another. You can't feed every hungry kid in the world, but I promise you that you can feed one. Or maybe you can feed 10, or maybe 20. You can't do everything. And I'm here to tell you that you can't do everything, but you can do something. And so God's going to speak to some of you, and you're going to realize, I'm not okay with this. I'm not just here on this earth to make some money, accumulate things, and then die, right? God put me here. And you're going to open up your heart to some injustice outside of yourself. And I'm here to tell you, we're going to have a church full of people who care. We're going to have a church full of people who care. We're going to get outside of ourselves. We're going to let God take that thing that makes us miserable, and God's going to turn it into a ministry. I'm here to tell you, God's going to raise you up. He's going to use you to change the world. If you're the best of the best and everyone knows you're a leader, God can still use you. It's just that he specializes in using ordinary people. So, worship team, if you guys can come back up. We're going to have you guys sing another hymn for us. And as they do that, I want us really to focus our hearts on God and the burden that he's given you, and to be in prayer for that burden. Maybe you have one already. Pray about it. Maybe you don't have one. Maybe you pray, hey, God, can you send the Holy Spirit to kind of open my heart to what's going on and what I need to focus on? What miserable thing in this world that affects you can he take and use for your ministry? Don't be afraid to cry for all the things that this world makes you sad. Don't be afraid to cry. Those things that are burdens on your heart, it's okay. Start the battle on your knees. And then pray. Pray to our Heavenly Father who loves us and hears us. Let him work in you and through you. And then finally, stand up and act. Do not just stay tucked away in your little corner only crying and praying. Get up and do something. Be like Popeye. That's all that I can stand.